Hey guys, how we doing today? It is a Saturday afternoon. I'll probably publish this tomorrow morning, Sunday morning. I like to air my episodes in the morning. I think it's the best time. But my schedule's kind of busy. I hope y'all enjoyed that 500th episode. If you haven't watched it yet, there's some great comments and tributes and thoughts and shares from a lot of the members on this channel at the end of that video. Definitely worth watching. I want to thank all you guys who contributed something to the channel for that piece. All you guys, thanks. That was great stuff. It's nice to see everyone else's thoughts and opinions, and I appreciate all the kind words as well. And I'd like to say to 500 more episodes, cheers. Let's march forward. Today I want to talk to you about two things. We're going to do a legacy album by an artist. We'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to share with you a series I just completed, and it's only 4 records, but it's a tough series to complete. And I'm talking about the great East West label, which was an affiliate of Atlantic, a subsidiary of Atlantic Records. And Atlantic actually brings the East West thing back in the 90s for hard rock metal. Like Pantera was on East West, so it had a second life. But East West had an initial brief introduction to the world in 56, 57, 58. Only 4 releases. Why they chose to put these titles on that little sub label, I'm not certain. 2 of them were recorded in Stockholm, but the other 2 weren't. 2 of the artists on this label have records also in the Atlantic 1200 series. All 4 of these records could be Atlantic 1200 series stuff. So how they ended up on this subsequence of East West, it's kind of hard to really get a gauge on that. I don't know. And it's not one of the things they really leave out for you there to find out. But this is Tommy Potter's Hard Funk. And Tommy Potter was a great bass player. He's part of the bebop scene. As a bass player, he didn't get a lot of roles as a leader, which is pretty common for bass players, sadly. Surprisingly, Bethlehem didn't pick him up, because Bethlehem certainly has their share of bass players as leaders. But this is a great session. Really cooks. The imp is fantastic. TNT is fantastic. I enjoyed the whole thing. You got Woody Birch on tenor, Rolf Erickson on trumpet, who's really dynamic. Swede, if I remember. Aka Persson on the trombone, Freddie Redd on the piano, a great piano player from America. Tommy Potter's on the bass and Joe Harris is on the drums. So this is one of those records that was recorded in Stockholm, if memory serves. Yeah, recorded in Stockholm. But sample copy not for sale on there. So this is a really old promo copy of this record, number 4001. And they have this little logo as part of their thing. And there's East West 4001. So that's a great record. This is the one that took me the longest to find. I don't know if the Japanese have reissued this. It's got another cover, which I never want those. This is a tough record to find. And a great part of the bebop movement into the more modern hard bop era. The next record I want to show you is by a great singer by the name of Jackie Paris. And this is a tough record to find. And believe it or not, I found this in the wild 3 years ago or so, back when I lived in Minneapolis. I was in a record store on the far northern suburbs of the Twin Cities. And this record store really was about rap and metal, because that's the clientele in those neighborhoods. Big pickup trucks, Copenhagen, chew, it's a tobacco thing, heavy metal and rap. Eminem and Kid Rock, like that's what these people like. And so the jazz section's very mined. There's not a lot of digging going on. And so every once in a while I'll go out there, and this record store is part of a chain called Cheapo. There's 3 or 4 locations. So they often get great stuff distributed to the store out there that there's not a lot of people looking for. So I'll often go out there and I'll flip through every jazz record in that store, because there's often great stuff in the cracks that you didn't expect to find. You're like, oh, sweet. This is the great Jackie Paris. He's a New York, New Jersey guy. Bit of a cabaret lounge jazz voice. He's a bit like Mel Torme. Joe DeRise, just a real soft. He's not singing like bright, like how some trumpet players are really bright. He's much softer with his tone, which allows for some inflection that kind of comes to life when you listen to him sing. He can enunciate and inflect certain things that give it a cheekiness and a funness. He's a bit like Johnny Hartman, honestly, even though Hartman's a baritone and he's more of an alto tenor range. But very beautiful singer. He really brings the songs and the lyrics to life. Great accompaniment on this, including Barry Galbraith, the guitar player, who is just simply outstanding on this. Really, this could be a Barry Galbraith record almost as much because he's so front and center. But you have Joe Benjamin on the bass, Ed Shaughnessy on the drums. There's another lineup here with Wendell Marshall on the bass and Bill Clark on the drums, it looks like. I love this record. I've had this one the longest, probably going back to like 2018 or so when I found this in the Twin Cities, maybe even 2017. But I've always been a big Jackie Paris fan. His Impulse record's also equally tough to find. His record on MRC, Mercury Wing, is really, really tough to find. Jackie Paris' stuff is kind of elusive, and he didn't have a long superlative recording career, but he certainly had a long career in the lounges and the bars, and was a pretty well-established guy on the East Coast in particular. But I've come to really love Jackie Paris' sound, and if you can find that record or you see it in the wild, I would absolutely recommend grabbing it. Now, these next two guys both had records in the 1200 sequence, and we're going to start with Lars Gulen, the Swedish guitar player, or saxophone player, and this was his 1200 sequence, 1246, which probably comes out in 1956. Also a very tough record to find. This is pushing 100, 150 bucks nowadays for nice old Atlantic pressings of this guy. Beautiful Atlantic stuff. And Atlantic's really one of the greatest jazz labels that doesn't get called a great jazz label on a regular basis. You know what I mean? There's a lot of great jazz labels, but most of them get that recognition on a regular basis. Atlantic has a pretty incredible discography. And what's crazy is there's two sequences. There's the 1200 sequence, which is more straightforward jazz, and there's the 8000 sequence, which is more straightforward blues, rhythm and blues, pop, rhythm and blues, and the 8000 sequence has some incredible stuff in it as well. You know, so there's a lot of artists appear on both those sequences. So the East-West was another addition to that. So this was the Lars Gulen quartet, quintet, sextet, octet big band. So obviously there's different members coming and going here. This is number 4003. Jackie Paris was 4002. Again, pretty tough record to find. And like the 1200 sequence one, this one's also starting to push the $100 mark. You know, and if these were on Blue Note or something, they'd be going for 3-4 times that. The last one I want to show you is by the great George Wallington, the Sicilian-born Italian who moved to New York at a young age. This was his Atlantic release, number 1275, which puts us probably 1957. Night Music or something it's called. Yeah, Night Music. George Wallington plays 5 originals with 6 standards. And I think this is a trio. It is. And it's with Teddy Kotick on the bass and Nick Stabulus on the drums, which is, I think, the same as this other one, band-wise. Let's just take a look here. So it's actually what's playing in the background quietly. And it's called the Prestidigitator, East-West 4004. Cool cover. Again, there's that kind of that logo there. There's the 4000 East-West 4004. And I think if I remember, it's Stabulus and Kotick on this as well. J.R. Montrose, actually, the sax player, is on some of this. I forgot about that. And Stabulus and Kotick, yep. And then there's a Jerry Lloyd who plays bass trumpet on some of this as well, which was really interesting. So it's a cool piece. Again, Atlantic's not afraid to take chances. So he actually has 2 records technically on Atlantic. But being that they're on different labels, a lot of people wouldn't associate them being both Atlantic records, but they really are. And I'm guessing they're not separated by more than a year or so. So again, why Atlantic just decides to throw these 4 records onto that sequence and then just cancel the sequence for 20 years to allow it to come back at some point. I'm not really sure. It's a cool sequence. It's worth finding. And I know it's one of those things where if you are out there in the wild, you're collecting records, you see East-West, you might not connect right away that that's Atlantic stuff. But it is, and it's of that same high quality Tom Dowd production. I think it's fantastic. Next, we're going to move on to our featured artist of the day, our legacy record contestant, and we're talking about Dexter Gordon today. And I'm a huge Dexter Gordon fan. And some of the more modern avant-garde people almost don't respect Dexter Gordon like they should. But Dexter Gordon is an incredibly important part of the jazz lineage. And he's a direct link from Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, and Lester Young, the three giants of the swing era, among many other guys, Chu Berry. It's a long list, but of those cats, Dexter Young was one of the real bridges to Rollins and Coltrane and Charlie Rouse and that next generation of players. Dexter's right there. And if you take his two West Coast LA Central Avenue partners of Wardell Gray and then Teddy Edwards, he played with both those guys a lot, the late 40s, early 50s. And there's a scramble of material out there of those guys work together, but not a lot of it's actual sessions. A lot of it's just kind of live, not the greatest sounding recordings. But those they were really combative, and they were playing bebop on the highest level on the West Coast. There's a reason why Parker and Dizzy went out there. They heard about that Central Avenue scene, and Dexter Gordon was at the center of it. He could play bebop with the best of them. And I love Wardell Gray, even though he dies really young. And from what I remember, this is the mob dump his body in the desert, Wardell Gray. Like, he has a bad ending at a young age. But Wardell and then Teddy Edwards, of course, who I've talked about with you recently a few times, was also part of that Central Avenue scene. These guys were all really important players that kind of get overlooked some today, especially Edwards and Wardell Gray. Dexter has some luminosity today, in part because of his Blue Note legacy. That's kept Dexter's name on a lot of people's tongues, more so even than Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young and Ben Webster, who are equally important, but because they don't have records on Blue Note, they're not really seen the same way by today's collectors, which is a real shame because all three of them are beautiful players. They're always modern from the very get-go. I've never heard of Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster recording where I'm like, oh, this isn't modern. This sounds dated. They're incredible players. And they're such modern players that they can transform any session they're a part of. So they're never to be overlooked. But again, back to Dexter. He has some great moments in those early 50s, and some people think of it as his prime, actually, when he's playing bebop. But he's also got a bad heroin habit. Like, we're talking in and out of jail bad. And he's spent some time in jail in 52, gets out, goes back to jail. He gets out for a little while in 55. He makes two albums that are really noteworthy here. And I would consider them both to be in the running for his legacy records. This one's on Bethlehem. Daddy Plays the Horn. Tough record to find an original copy of. They go for $1,000. Then Dexter Blows Hot and Cool on Dutone, or Dutu, depending on which area your pressing's from. It's one of those labels that had to change names. One of the iconic album covers of him at, is it Berlin or the Royal Roost? I think he's at the Royal Roost, I think. Great album cover. Great jazz moment. And these are both from 55. And they catch him kind of between bebop going into more modern, cool bop, even elements of the cool. This is a West Coast label due to, and so there's definitely some cool happening on this one. And this one as well. So he's departing from the inaccessibility to some degree of what the bebop scene was. And the players knew it. They knew how the audiences were responding to stuff. And they were always going to respond to accessible more than inaccessible, which a lot of today's collectors seem to forget. To show you how in and out his career was for a guy that we think of as one of the big stars of the scene. He was such a junkie and so in and out of jail that Stan Levy, the drummer, who plays with Dizzy Parker early on in his career, Levy, fantastic player, he goes to the West Coast and he makes some recordings with those great young West Coast kids. You know, the Williamson boys, the Charlie Marianos, the Frank Rosalinos. But he gets 2 records as a leader on Bethlehem, which are rather overlooked. And this record in particular here, this time the drum's on me. There's his feet sticking out of the bottom of the pile of drum cases. He's playing with Conti Condoli on the trumpet, Frank Rosalino on the trombone, Leroy Vinegar on the bass, Lou Levy on the piano, who's a Chicago native and a great pianist, part of the West Coast cool scene as well. And then Stan Levy on the drums. Who's on the tenor? Dexter Gordon. So Dexter is playing as a sideman with a young kid who's a drummer on a pretty anonymous label session. Like, that's where Dexter's career was. He wasn't a giant, even though he should have been. He's still willing to do some side work. And of course, he goes back to jail for another 3 or 4 years after these 2 records. Those 3 records, I should say. But very sadly. And he spends another 4 years wasting away in prison. And then he comes back and he makes this record for Jazzland Riverside, which he's kind of, I feel like he's shaking out the rust a little bit on that one. It's a good record. It's worth having. It's part of the chronology and the discography. But, you know, and thank goodness for Keep News, you know, and Bill Grauer allowing Dexter to have that opportunity. But it's really when it comes to Blue Note that he really gets the doors open for his career once again. And it's not long before he goes back to Europe and stays for a long time and has another resurgence in the 80s when he comes back from Europe again. I think he comes back at the right time. And he really gets part of that, the rebirth revival that happened in the 80s with trad jazz. But after that session at Riverside, he gets signed by Alfred at Blue Note. And the thing to remember about Dexter Gordon at Blue Note is Dexter's not the hard bop kids. Dexter's a bebop guy from an older generation. But he's kind of been influenced by the cool. And people forget that all these players who played bebop always had the middle of the road in them. They always had the cool. The cool is never, anyone can play the cool in a way, you know. So for him to come back to the center of the road a little bit and make more accessible records, it's not shocking. And he wasn't of the militancy of these East Coast young, aggressive hard bop cats. So he's not making traditional Blue Note records in the sense of what was happening around him. And he shows up here probably in 1960, 61, late 60, early 61 at Blue Note. And he makes a string of 6 or 7 records that I think are just amazing, beautiful records. They're not going to reinvent the wheel. They're not going to follow the avant-garde trends and the free jazz trends. They're not concerned with trying to be labeled or named. He's just playing good music. And so they're kind of an anomaly in the Blue Note catalog at this point. Although Ike Quebec would be a similar cross-reference. Mobley at times could do ballads and play like what a Dexter was doing. And again, Dexter's so important to all of that scene. But he kind of relaunches his career here at Blue Note with 4077 doing all right. And he's in the carriage by Central Park. The carriage rides there. And they plumped him in a carriage. Long, cool, tall Dexter. And he was a beautiful man. He was like 6'4", 6'5". Just a long, tall drink of water. A ladies' man. It just made the gals croon from what I've understood. This is a great return to the scene. And he's got Freddie Hubbard here to give him some legitimacy with the kids, along with the great Horace Parlan, the great pianist, with George Tucker and Al Harewood. And this is a fantastic resurfacing of a brilliant player, and he's not trying to reinvent the wheel. He's making records that are going to sell and have a shelf life, And almost every one of these records I'm about to show you right now has a ballad or two on them that are just fantastic. Another great record is Dexter Gordon, Dexter Gordon. And again, the cover, Reed Miles, classic. Again, this is a record cover that you could see put out today for some indie folk singer, indie rock singer, R&B. It's like these Reed Miles covers are just so iconic and just stood stand the test of time. Unlike most innovative graphic design, Reed Miles' work is still very much relative and representative of what could still be happening today. Here's playing with Kenny Drew on the piano, with Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones, a nice quartet. A beautiful record, and like I said, End of a Love Affair is fantastic. I Want More, beautiful stuff, Smile. The next record, we're going to look at here is Dexter Gordon Go 4112. This pushes us probably into 62, I would guess, 4112. And Dexter Gordon Go. And he's playing with Butch Warren, the great Sonny Clark. And this is after Clark's return to Blue Note after he departed for a little while. And Clark's not doing very well at this point, but he's still a powerful force and presence in the studio. He's playing with Butch Warren on the bass and Billy Higgins on the drums. And I guess I'll hang my tears out to dry on this. It's just bliss. It's just a wonderful showcase. And Love for Sale's great. 3 o'clock in the morning is beautiful. Just fantastic. I think it's the same 3 o'clock in the morning that Duke Pearson does on Tender Moments. Just love that song. Dexter Gordon, A Swingin' Affair, 4133. This one's a great record with Butch Warren, Billy Higgins, and Sonny Clark again. So again, it's that same quartet. And again, there's a ballad on here that's just fantastic. Till the Real Thing Comes Along. Just forget about it. Soy Khalifa's great. You Stepped Out of a Dream. These are beautiful records. And there aren't trademark Blue Note sound necessarily, but they're still fantastic. Our Man in Paris. Now we're talking probably 64. And I think this is actually recorded in Paris with Bud Powell, Pierre Michelot, and Kenny Clark. And those guys were all living over there at that point. Bud, Pierre, of course, was a Frenchman. And then Kenny Clark had been in Europe for a few years at this point. And these guys just found a safety being in Paris, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Munich, Hamburg, Brussels, Amsterdam. There was just a place where they were appreciated and valued and felt safe. A lot of guys spent a long time there. Like I said, Dexter Gordon's in Europe, I think from 65 through into the early 80s or late 70s. He spends a long time in the European scene. This is also recorded in Europe, if I remember, 4176. This is an outstanding record. And Tanya is one of the coolest pieces Blue Note ever does. It's got this nice, solid rhythm and blues jump to it, but it's got this tactile kind of percussiveness, and it's just fantastic. Donald Byrd's on this, along with Kenny Drew, Niels Henning Orsted, and Art Taylor. I don't remember Byrd living in Europe, but they all visited for sure. And it's possible that Byrd was over there for a little stretch of time. I can't remember. And Art Taylor, I don't know if he lived in Europe ever either. I'm not sure on that. But again, Tanya is just a fantastic piece. Niels Henning Orsted Pedersen, he's a Dutch bass player who's just outstanding. Beautiful stuff. Great groove. A really modern approach. And this is 4204, getting around Dexter Gordon with Bobby Hutcherson, Barry Harris, Bobby Cranshaw, and Billy Higgins. Another iconic Reed Miles cover. There's just a modernity to these covers that you can't replicate. You can't fake it. You have to have it. And Reed Miles had it. And I don't think this one was recorded in Europe, but I could be wrong. But it's an all-American band, so I don't think so. You don't see Barry Harris on the piano on Blue Note very often. The great Detroit piano player who was a great educator, was a big part of teaching jazz in New York for a long time. He does a couple more sessions for Blue Note that don't get put out at that time. So I don't feel like I can add Landslide and Clubhouse into this conversation for his legacy record, because your legacy record can't be something that was shelved for a long time. That's just not how legacy records work. And so if you have to look at these records, Dexter Gordon, Getting Around, One Flight Up, Our Man in Paris, Swingin' Affair. For me, I think it comes down to these two, with the Sonny Clark or the Kenny Drew on the piano. And I'm going to go with this one for my own personal preference here, based off of, I Guess I Hang My Tears Out to Dry, almost in and of itself for me. It's such a great song. I've played it at so many gigs. It's just got this warmth and melancholic approach. It beckons, it calls you, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful experience. It's probably my go-to Dexter Gordon, but I do play all those records. And I play the Do To and the Bethlehem record quite a lot as well. And again, when you have 6,000 jazz records and 14,000 records all together, you don't get to play records as often as you would like. But I also have a Dexter Gordon Pandora station, because I think he's a great source to stream as a great center for my algorithm to spring out from. You get a lot of good stuff if you use him as your starting place. So I'm a big Dexter Gordon guy. I think he's certainly one of the most iconic, important players on the tenor sax in the history of this music. And his string of records at at Blue Note, are top of the mark. Again, not if you're looking for the avant-garde, not if you're looking for dissonance and Jackie McLean and edges. It's just sweet, beautiful Lester Young, Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins, with a little more modernity and having the experience of played bebop. And again, Coleman Hawkins, those guys had. Lester Young dabbled in bebop. Coleman Hawkins dabbled in bebop. So these guys weren't foreign to it, but he was just definitely that next generation, and he's a bridge between the Rollins and Coltrane and those early generation guys. So Dexter deserves all the praise and all the credit in the world. He should be a part of everyone's collection. What's your go-to Dexter Gordon record? And do you agree that Go is his legacy record? I mean, the Dutone record would be right up there as well. I love that record. I listen to it a lot. So it's a tough call. Some of these guys are really tough to pick one record as their legacy record. And again, legacy doesn't mean it's my favorite record by someone. It means if 100 years passed and they had one record left by this guy in print, what would it be? My guess, it would be Go. It's a great, accessible, beautiful piece. But you could almost pick any of those Blue Notes to be that. You really could. The Dutone, the Bethlehem, those are both really solid records as well. So you gotta love Dexter Gordon. All the credit in the world. That East-West stuff is cool stuff. We'll be back at you more with a couple days with another episode. I appreciate all you guys' support. Seriously, love, peace, and everything else. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit that like button. Hit the bell for the alerts if you want them. If you want to support the channel, go to the Patreon page in the description below. Go to the merchandise store, buy a t-shirt or a hoodie. It all helps support the channel in every way. So appreciate you guys. Y'all be safe. Here's to 500 more episodes, guys. Peace.